Earlier we saw for each loops being used to loop over both lists of numbers or lists of strings and characters in a string. Now let's try to do both at once. Let's take our example of counting the number of words in a string and instead try to write some code that would count the number of words in multiple strings. Here on line 3, we create a variable called list of strings and we assign it to a list as defined by those brackets. That list of strings has 5 values, 5 strings. This is the first string, this is the second string, third, fourth, and fifth. Each of those is a different string, a different value. And so list of strings is a list of 5 different strings. Notice real quick that this is another way we can break single long lines of code down into multiple lines in Python. If we've already started declaring a list with these brackets, and then we have a line break after a comma, Python assumes that those are just continuations of the previous line. It knows that the list doesn't terminate until it finds that close bracket. So as before, we then create our counter for our number of spaces and set it equal to 0, and then we create a for loop. Initially, our for loop runs over each string in our list of strings. So it runs the body of the loop once for every string in this list. So we can tell it's going to run that body 5 times because there are 5 strings in our list of strings. So it takes that first value, the string this is the first string, loads that into current string, and then runs the interior of the loop. The interior of the loop then creates a new for loop for current character in current string. So now one by one we're going to loop over the individual characters or the individual letters in the first string from our list of strings. And then for each one of those, we're going to check to see if the current character from that string is a space. And then if so, we'll increment our count of the number of spaces that we've found. So to trace through this, on the first run, this is the first string, gets loaded into current string. Then on line 10, we create a for loop that runs over each character in that string. So it runs for T isn't a space, H isn't a space, I isn't a space, S isn't a space, then space, which is a space, and so it would come down and increment number of spaces and add 1 to it. It continues this for each individual character in that string. And in the end, it finds 4 spaces. And so at the end of running this interior for loop the first time, for all the characters in the first string from the list of strings, the number of spaces is 4. Then at the end, it comes back to the top level for loop, or what we might call the outer loop, and checks to see again, am I done yet? Well, no, there's still 4 more strings for which we need to run the inside code. And so it repeats everything on the inside for the second string, and then the third string, and then the fourth string, and then the fifth string. Notice that num spaces was declared before either of these for loops, and so its value is never reset to 0, because line 6 is never run again. So when this inside loop starts running for the second string, num spaces still has the value it had after it ran for the first string. So when the second string starts to be counted, num spaces has a value of 4. When we're done counting the second string, it has a value of 8. After the third string, it has a value of 12. After the fourth, a value of 16. And after the fifth, a value of 20. And we can visually check and see if that's correct. We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. So sure enough, the correct answer is 20. But at the end, there's one more detail. Remember, we assume that there's always one more word than the number of spaces we counted because we assume that the last word in the string doesn't end in a space, it just ends with the end of the string. Here that's true for the last word in every individual string. So instead of just adding 1 to our number of spaces, we have to add 1 for every string in our list of strings. We could do that just by adding 1 at the end of each execution of our outer loop, which would add 1 for each time the loop has to run, which means it's adding 1 for each string in the list of strings. Or at the end, we could just add however many strings were in that list. There were 5 strings, so we know to add 5. So we add 5 to the number of spaces we counted, which makes num words equal 25, and so it prints that there are 25 words in these strings, which again we could visually confirm. The major takeaway here is how these two loops interact. This outer loop runs 5 times, 1 for each string in the list of strings. This inner loop then ran 24 or 25 times for each individual string inside of list of strings. So this conditional was actually checked about 125 different times, once for each character in any of the strings. When we have 2 loops nested within one another, we usually call the first loop that we encounter the outer loop, and the second one the inner loop. If we have more than 2, then we don't really have a fancy term for them. Now, if this is confusing, try to think of other examples where you might encounter this. Imagine, for example, I wanted to find which page in a set of textbooks has a picture of a dog. Well, for each book, you'd go for each page and look for a dog. There's 2 loops. You'd loop over all the books, and within each book, you'd loop over each individual page.